left extremely weak, Maurice said, holding her skirt up as she hurried along. Narishma followed them, the bells at the end of his braids ringing softly. Daigyan is dead. We're not certain why the other two were left alive. Warders, Cadsuane said. Kill the Aes Sedai and their warders would know immediately, and we would have learned that something was wrong. The warders should have noticed that something was wrong anyway. They'd have to interrogate the men to see what they had felt. But there was likely a correlation. Daigyan had no living warder. Cadsuane felt a stab of regret for the pleasant sister, but shoved it aside. No time for it now. The other two were placed in some kind of trance, Maurice said. I could see no remnants of weaves, nor could Narishma. We discovered the sisters just before the alarm was sounded, then went for you as soon as we were assured that Althor was alive and our enemies had been dealt with. Cadsuane nodded crossly. Of all the nights to be out visiting the wise ones in their tents. Soralia and a small group of them followed behind Narishma, and Cadsuane didn't dare slow her pace, lest the Aiel women trample her in their haste to see Althor. They reached the top of the stairs, then sped down the hallway toward Althor's room. How could he have gotten himself into this much trouble again? And how had that blasted Forsaken gotten free of herself? Someone must have helped her, but that meant a dark friend in their camp. It wasn't unlikely. If dark friends existed in the White Tower, then they could undoubtedly be found here. But what dark friend could incapacitate 3 Aes Sedai? Surely channeling on that level should have been felt by every sister or Ashaman in the camp. Was the tea involved? Cadsuane asked Maurice quietly. Not that we can tell, the Green replied. We'll know more when the other two wake. They fell unconscious as soon as we brought them out of their trance. Cadsuane nodded. Althor's door was open, and maidens swarmed outside it like wasps who had just discovered their nest was gone. Cadsuane couldn't say that she blamed them. Apparently Althor had said little of what had happened. The fool boy was lucky to still be alive. What a light-cursed mess, Cadsuane thought, passing the maidens and entering the chamber. A small knot of Aes Sedai clustered on the far side of the room, speaking quietly. Serene, Arian, Beldain, all of those in the camp who weren't either dead or incapacitated, except Elza. Where was Elza? The 3 nodded to Cadsuane as she entered, but she spared them barely a glance. Min sat on the bed, rubbing her neck, eyes red, short hair disheveled, face pale. Althor stood beside the open far window, looking out at the night, his hand clasping his stump behind him. His coat lay rumpled on the floor, and he stood in white shirt sleeves, a cool wind blowing in and ruffling his red-gold hair. Cadsuane surveyed the room. Behind her, in the hall, the wise ones began to interrogate the maidens. Well, Cadsuane said, what happened? Min looked up. There were red marks on her neck, the beginnings of bruises. Rand did not turn from the window. Insolent boy, Cadsuane thought, coming farther into the room. Speak up, boy, she said. We need to know if the camp is in danger. The danger has been dealt with, he said softly. Something in his voice made her hesitate. She'd been expecting anger, or perhaps satisfaction from him. Fatigue at the very least. Instead, his voice sounded cool. Will you explain what that means? Cadsuane demanded. Finally he turned, looking at her. She took an involuntary step backward, though she couldn't say why. He was still the same foolish boy, too tall, too self-confident, and too blunt-headed. There was a strange serenity about him now, but it had a dark edge, like the serenity one saw in the eyes of a condemned man the moment before he stepped up to the hangman's noose. Narishma, Rand said, looking past Cadsuane. I have a weave for you. Memorize it. I will show it to you only once. With that, Althor put his hand out to the side. and a bar of brilliant white fire shot from between his fingers and struck his coat, which lay on the floor. It vanished in a burst of light. Cadsuane hissed. I told you never to use that weave, boy. You will never do so again. Do you hear me? This is not... That is the weave we must use when fighting Forsaken, Narishma, al'Thor said, his quiet voice cutting straight through Cadsuane's. If we kill them with anything else, they can be reborn. It is a dangerous tool, but still just a tool, like any other. It is forbidden, Cadsuane said. I have decided that it is not, al'Thor said calmly. You don't have any idea what that weave can do. You're a child playing with... I have seen balefire destroy cities, al'Thor said, eyes growing haunted. I've seen thousands burned from the pattern by its purifying flames. If you call me a child, Cadsuane, then what are those of you who are thousands of years my juniors? He met her gaze. Light. What had happened to him? She struggled to collect her thoughts. So Semirhage is dead? Worse than dead, al'Thor said, and far better off in many ways, I should think. Well then, I suppose we can get on with... Do you recognize that, Cadsuane? al'Thor said, nodding toward something metallic sitting on the bed, mostly hidden by the sheets. Hesitantly, she walked forward. Soralea looked over, expression unreadable. Apparently, she didn't wish to be drawn into the conversation when al'Thor was in such a mood. Cadsuane didn't blame her. Cadsuane pulled back the sheets, revealing a familiar pair of bracelets. There was no collar. Impossible, she whispered. That is what I assumed, al'Thor said in that terribly calm voice of his. I told myself that it obviously couldn't be one of the same ter'angreal I relinquished to you. You promised they would be protected and hidden. Well then, Cadsuane said, unnerved. She covered the things back up. That is settled then. It is. I sent people to your room. Tell me, is this box where you were keeping the bracelets? We found it open on the floor of your quarters. A maiden brought out a familiar oak box. It was the same one, obviously. Cadsuane turned toward him in anger. You searched my room. I was unaware that you were visiting the Wise Ones, al'Thor said. He gave a small nod of respect to Soralea and Amis, which they hesitantly returned. I sent servants to check on you as I feared that Semirhage might have tried for revenge on you. They shouldn't have touched this, Cadsuane said, taking the box from the maiden. It was prepared with very intricate wards. Not intricate enough, al'Thor said, turning away from her. He still stood by that darkened window, looking out over the camp. The room fell silent. Narishma had been asking quietly after Min's health, but he fell silent when al'Thor stopped speaking. Rand obviously felt that Cadsuane was responsible for the male Adon being stolen, but that was preposterous. She had prepared the best ward she knew, but who knew what knowledge the Forsaken had for getting past wards? How had al'Thor survived? And what of the other contents of that box? Did al'Thor now have the access key? Or had the statuette been taken by Semirhage? Did Cadsuane dare ask? The silence continued. What are you waiting for? She finally asked, with all the bravado she could summon. Do you expect an apology from me? From you? al'Thor asked. There was no humor in his voice, just the same cold evenness. No. I suspect that I could sooner extract an apology from a stone than from you. Then you are exiled from my sight, Cadsuane, he said softly. If I see your face again after tonight, I will kill you. Rand, no, Min said, standing up beside the bed. He didn't turn toward her. Cadswain felt an immediate stab of panic, but shoved it aside with her anger. What? She demanded. This is foolishness, boy. He turned, and again that gaze of his made her trail off. There was a danger to it, a shadowy cast to his eyes that struck her with more fear than she thought her aging heart could summon. As she watched, the air around him seemed to warp, and she could almost think that the room had grown darker. But, she found herself stuttering, but you don't kill women. Everyone knows it. You can hardly put the maidens into danger for fear of them getting hurt. I have been forced to revise that particular inclination, Althor said. As of tonight. But, Cadswain, he said softly, do you believe that I could kill you? Right here, right now, without using a sword or the power? Do you believe that if I simply willed it, the pattern would bend around me and stop your heart by coincidence? Being ta'veren didn't work that way. Light. It didn't, did it? He couldn't bend the very pattern to his will, could he? And yet, meeting his eyes, she did believe. Against all logic, she looked in those eyes and knew that if she didn't leave, she would die. She nodded slowly, hating herself, strangely weak. He turned away from her, looking back out the window. Be certain that I do not see your face ever again, Cadswain. You may go now. Dazed, she turned, and from the corner of her eye she saw a deep darkness emanating from Althor, warping the air even further. When she glanced back, it was gone. With gritted teeth, she left. Prepare yourself and your armies, Althor said to those who remained, voice echoing in the room behind. I intend to be gone by week's end. Cadswain raised a hand to her heart and leaned against the hallway wall outside, heart thumping, hands sweating. Before, she had been working against a stubborn but good-hearted boy. Someone had taken that child and replaced him with this man, a man more dangerous than any she had ever met. Day by day, he was slipping away from them, and at the moment she hadn't a blasted clue what to do about it.
Chapter 24. A New Commitment. Exhausted from 2 days of riding, Gawain sat atop Challenge on a low hill southwest of Tar-Baron. This countryside should have been green with spring's arrival, but the hillside before him bore only scraggly dead weeds, slain by the winter snows. Tufts of yew and blackwood poked up here and there, breaking the brown landscape. He counted more than a few stands that were now populated only by stumps. A war camp devoured trees like hungry wood gnarls, using them for arrows, fires, buildings, and siege equipment. Gawain yawned. He'd pushed hard through the night. Bryn's war camp was well dug in here, and was a bustle of motion and activity. An army this large spawned organized chaos at best. A small band of mounted cavalry could travel light, as Gawain's younglings had. A force like that could grow to several thousand and remain lean. Expert horsemen, like the Saldaeans, were said to manage larger bands of 7,000 or 8,000 while keeping their mobility. But a force like the one below was a different beast entirely. It was an enormous, sprawling thing, in the shape of an enormous bubble with a smaller camp at its center. That probably held the Aes Sedai. Bryn also had forces occupying all of the bridge towns on both sides of the River Arnon, effectively cutting off the island from ground supply. The army squatted near Tar-Baron like a spider eyeing a butterfly hovering just outside of its web. Lines of troops rode in and out patrolling, purchasing food, running messages. Dozens upon dozens of squads, some mounted, others walking. Like bees leaving the hive, while others swarmed back in. The eastern side of the
Max, how you doing, bro?
With a mishmash of shanties
It's
and
about
tents,
to roll one up.
the normal riffraff of camp followers that collected around an army. Nearby, just inside the main war camp boundary, a wooden palisade, perhaps 50 yards across, rose in a tall ring, probably a command post. Gowan knew he had been seen by Bryn's scouts as he approached, yet none had stopped him. They probably wouldn't unless he tried to ride away. A single man wearing a decent gray cloak and trousers with a lacing shirt of white wasn't of much interest. He could be a sellsword coming to ask for a place in the ranks. He could be a messenger from a local lord sent to complain about a group of scouts. He could even be a member of the army. While many of those in Bryn's force wore uniforms, many others just wore a simple yellow band on their coat sleeves, not yet able to pay for proper insignia to be sewn on. No, a single man approaching the army was not a danger. A single man riding away from it, however, was cause for alarm. A man coming to the camp could be friend, foe, or neither. A man who inspected the camp, then rode away, was almost certainly a spy. So long as Gowan didn't leave before making his intentions known, Bryn's outriders would be unlikely to bother him. Light, but he could use a bed. He'd spent a restless 2 nights, sleeping only a couple of hours during each one, wrapped in his cloak. He felt irritable and cranky, partially just at himself for refusing to go to an inn, lest he be chased by the younglings. He blinked bleary eyes and spurred challenge down the incline. He was committed now. No, he'd been committed the moment he'd left Sleet behind in Dorlan. By now, the younglings knew of their leader's betrayal. Sleet wouldn't allow them to waste time searching. He'd tell them what he knew. Gowan wished he could convince himself that they'd be surprised. But he'd received more than one frown or look of confusion regarding the way he spoke of Elaida and the Aes Sedai. The White Tower didn't deserve his allegiance, but the younglings, he could never go back to them now. It itched at him.
How you
This
doing,
was the
Mix?
first time his wavering had been revealed to a large group. Nobody knew that he'd helped Swan escape, nor was it widespread knowledge that he'd dallied with Egwene. Yet leaving had been the right thing to do. For the first time in months, his actions matched his heart. Saving Egwene. That was something he could believe in. He approached the outskirts of camp, keeping his face impassive. He hated the idea of working with the rebel Aes Sedai almost as much as he had hated abandoning his men. These rebels were no better than Elaida. They were the ones who had propped Egwene up as an armorman, as a target. Egwene, a mere accepted, a pawn. If they failed in their bid for the tower, they themselves might be able to escape punishment. Egwene would be executed. I'll get in, Gowan thought. I'll save her somehow. Then I'll talk some sense into her and bring her away from all of the Aes Sedai. Perhaps even talk sense into Bryn. We can all get back to Andor to help Elaine. He rode forward with renewed determination, banishing some of his exhaustion. To reach the command post, he had to ride through the camp followers, who outnumbered the actual troops. Cooks to fix the food, women to serve the food and wash the soiled dishes, wagon drivers to carry the food, wheelwrights to fix the wagons that carried the food, blacksmiths to make horseshoes for the horses that pulled the wagons that carried the food, merchants to buy the food, and quartermasters to organize it. Less reputable merchants who sought to profit off of the soldiers and their battle pay, and women who sought to do the same. Boys to run messages, hoping to someday carry a sword themselves. It was a complete mess. A half-shanty conglomeration of tents and shacks, each of a different hue, design, and state of disrepair. Even a capable general like Bryn could impose only so much order on camp followers. His men would keep the peace, more or less, but they couldn't force followers to keep military discipline. Gowan passed through the middle of it all, ignoring those who called to him, offering to shine his sword or sell him a sweet bun. The prices would be low. This was a place that fed off of soldiers. But with his warhorse and finer clothing, he'd be marked as an officer. If he bought from one, the others would smell coin, and he could end up surrounded by all who hoped to sell to him. He ignored the calls, eyes forward, toward the army itself ahead. Its tents were generally organized in neat rows, grouped by squad and banner, though sometimes in smaller clusters. Gowan could have guessed the layout without seeing it. Bryn liked organization, but also believed strongly in delegation. Bryn would allow officers to run their camps as they wished, and that led to a setup that was less uniform, yet was far better at running itself. He headed directly for the palisade. The camp followers around him weren't easy to ignore, however. Their calls to him lingered in the air, together with the sense of cooking, privies, horses, and cheap perfume. The camp wasn't as crowded as a city, but it also wasn't as well maintained. Sweat mixed with burning cook fires, mixed with stagnant water, mixed with unwashed bodies. It made him want to hold a handkerchief to his face, though he refrained. It would make him look like a spoiled noble, turning his nose up at the common people. The stink, the confusion, and the yells didn't help his mood any. He had to grit his teeth to keep himself from cursing at each hawker. A figure stumbled onto the pathway in front of him. He reined in. The woman wore a brown skirt and a white blouse, her hands grimy. "Out of the way," Gowan snapped. His mother would have been outraged to hear him speaking with such anger. Well, his mother was dead now, by Althor's hand. The woman in front of him looked up and ran back out of the pathway. She had light hair tied in a yellow kerchief and a faintly plump body. Gowan caught just a glimpse of her face as she turned. Gowan froze. That was an Aes Sedai face. It was unmistakable. He sat, shocked, as the woman pulled her kerchief down and hurried away. "Wait," he called, turning his horse. But the woman did not stop. He hesitated, lowering his arm as he saw the woman join a line of washwomen working between several wooden troughs a short distance away. If she was pretending to be a common woman, then she likely had her own blasted Aes Sedai reasons, and she wouldn't appreciate him exposing her. Very well. Gowan forced down his annoyance. Egwene. He had to focus on Egwene. When he reached the command palisade, the air improved measurably. A quartet of soldiers stood on guard, halberds held at their sides, steel caps gleaming and matched by breastplates emblazoned with Bryn's 3 stars. A banner bearing the flame of Tar Valon flapped beside the gateway. "Recruit?" asked one of the soldiers as Gowan rode up. The heavy-set man bore a red stripe on his left shoulder, marking him as a watch sergeant. He carried a sword instead of a halberd. His breastplate barely fit his girth, and his chin bristled with red hairs. "You'll have to meet with Captain Alden," the man said with a grunt. "Big blue tent about a quarter of the way around the outside of the camp. You've got your own horse and sword. That'll get you good pay." The man pointed toward a distant point in the main body of the army outside the palisade. That wouldn't do. He could see Bryn's banner flying inside. "I'm not a recruit," Gowan said, turning challenge to get a better look at the men. "My name is Gowan Trakand. I need to speak with Garth Bryn immediately about a matter of some urgency." The soldier raised an eyebrow. Then he chuckled to himself. "You don't believe me," Gowan said flatly. "You should go speak to Captain Alden," the man said lazily, pointing toward the distant tent again. Gowan took a calming breath, trying to force down his irritation. "If you'd just send for Bryn, you'd find that—" "Are you going to be trouble?" the soldier asked, puffing himself up. The other men readied their halberds. "No trouble," Gowan said evenly. "I just need—" "If you're going to be in our camp," the soldier interrupted, stepping forward, "you're going to have to learn how to do what you're told." Gowan met the man's eyes. "Very well. We can do it this way. It will probably be faster anyway." The sergeant laid a hand on his sword. Gowan kicked his feet free of the stirrups and pushed himself out of the saddle. It would be too hard to keep from killing the man from horseback. He slid his blade free as his feet hit the muddy ground, the sheath rasping like an inhaled breath. Gowan fell into Oak Shakes its branches, a form that wielded non-lethal blows, often used by masters for training their students. It was also very effective against a large group, all using different weapons. Before the sergeant had his sword free, Gowan slammed into him, ramming an elbow into his gut just beneath the poorly fitting breastplate. The man grunted and bent. Then Gowan knocked him on the side of the head with the hilt of his sword. The man should have known better than to wear his cap askew like that. Then Gawain fell into parting the silk to deal with the first halberdier. As another of the men screamed for help, Gawain's blade slashed across the first halberdier's breastplate with a ringing sound, forcing the man back. Gawain finished by sweeping the man's feet from under him, then fell into twisting the wind to block a pair of blows from the other two men. It was unfortunate, but he had to resort to striking the thighs of the two standing halberdiers. He'd have preferred to avoid wounding them, but fights, even one such as this against far less skilled opponents, became unpredictable the longer they lasted. One had to control the battlefield quickly and soundly, and that meant dropping the two soldiers, clutching their bleeding thighs. The sergeant was out cold from the rat to the head, but the first halberdier was rising shakily. Gawain kicked the man's halberd aside, then planted a boot in his face, knocking him back and bloodying his nose. Challenge whinnied from behind, snorting and stamping the ground. The warhorse sensed a fight, but was well trained. He knew that when his reins were dropped, he was to remain still. Gawain whacked his blade on his trouser leg, then slid it back into its sheath, the wounded soldiers groaning on the ground. He patted Challenge on the nose and took up the reins again. Behind Gawain, nearby camp followers backed away, then ran. A group of soldiers from inside the palisade approached with bows drawn. That was not good. Gawain turned to face them, pulling his still-sheathed sword free from his belt and tossing it to the ground in front of the men. "I am unarmed," he said over the sounds of the wounded, "and none of these four will die this day. Go and tell your general that a lone blade master just felled a squad of his guards in under 10 heartbeats. I'm an old student of his. He'll want to see me." One of the men scrambled forward to take Gawain's fallen sword while another signaled to a runner. The others kept their bows raised. One of the fallen halberdiers began to crawl away. Gawain turned Challenge at an angle, making ready to duck behind the horse if the soldiers moved to draw. He'd much preferred not to come to that, but of the two of them, Challenge was far more likely to survive a few short bow shafts than Gawain. Several of the soldiers risked coming forward to help their fallen friends. The heavy-set watch sergeant was stirring, and he sat up, cursing under his breath. Gawain made no threatening motions. Perhaps it had been a mistake to fight the men, but he had already wasted too much time. Egwene could be dead by now. When a man like that sergeant tried to assert his authority, you really only had two options. You could talk your way up through the ranks of the bureaucracy, convincing each soldier each step of the way that you were important, or you could make a disturbance. The second was faster, and the camp obviously had enough Aes Sedai to heal a few injured soldiers. Eventually, a small group of men strode out from inside the palisade. Their uniforms were sharp, their postures dangerous, their faces worn. At their head came a square-faced man with graying temples and a strong, stocky build. Gawain smiled. Bryn himself. The gamble had worked. The Captain General surveyed Gawain, then moved on to a quick inspection of his fallen soldiers. At last he shook his head. "Stand down," he said to his men. "Sergeant Cords." The stocky sergeant stood up. "Sir." Bryn glanced back at Gawain. "Next time a man comes to the gate claiming to be nobility and asking for me, send for an officer. Immediately. I don't care if the man has 2 months of scruffy beard and reeks of cheap ale. Understood?" "Yes, sir," the sergeant said, blushing. "Understood, sir." "See your men to the infirmary, Sergeant," Bryn said, still looking at Gawain. "You, come with me." Gawain clenched his jaw. He hadn't received such an address from Garth Bryn since before he'd started shaving. Still, he couldn't really expect the man to be pleased. Just inside the palisade, Gawain spotted a young boy who was likely a stable hand or a messenger boy. He handed Challenge to the wide-eyed youth, instructing him to see the horse cared for. Then Gawain retrieved his sword from the man holding it and hurried after Bryn. "Garth," Gawain said, catching up. "Hold your tongue, young man," Bryn said, not turning toward him. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do with you." Gawain snapped his mouth closed. That was uncalled for. Gawain was still brother to the rightful Queen of Andor, and would be first Prince of the Sword should Elaine take and hold the throne. Bryn should show him respect. But Bryn could be stubborn as a boar. Gowan held his tongue. They reached a tall, peaked tent with 2 guards at the front. Bryn ducked inside and Gowan followed. The inside was neat and clean, more so than Gowan had expected. The desk was stacked with rolled maps and orderly sheets of paper, and the pallets in the corner were rolled carefully, blankets folded with sharp angles. Bryn was obviously relying on someone meticulous to tidy up for him. Bryn clasped his hands behind his back, breastplate reflecting Gowan's face as he turned around. "All right. Explain what you're doing here." Gowan drew himself up. "General," he said, "I think you mistake yourself. I'm no longer your student." "I know," Bryn said curtly. "The boy I trained would never have pulled a childish stunt like that one to get my attention. The watch sergeant was belligerent, and I had no patience for the posturing of a fool. This seemed the best way." "The best way to what?" Bryn asked. "Outrage me?" "Look," Gowan said. "Perhaps I was hasty, but I have an important task. You need to listen to me." "And if I don't?" Bryn asked. "If I instead throw you out of my camp for being a spoiled princeling with too much pride and not enough sense?" Gowan frowned. "Be careful, Gareth. I've learned a great deal since we last met. I think you'll find that your sword can no longer best mine as easily as it once did." "I have no doubt of that," Bryn said. "Light boy, you always were a talented one. But you think that just because you're skilled with the sword, your words hold more weight. I should listen because you'll kill me if I don't? I thought I taught you far better than that." Bryn had aged since Gowan had last seen him. But that age didn't bow Bryn down. It rested comfortably on his shoulders. A few more traces of white at his temples, a few more wrinkles around the eyes, yet strong and lean enough of body that he looked years younger than he was. One couldn't look at Gareth Bryn and see anything other than a man in, certainly not past, his prime. Gowan locked eyes with the general, trying to keep the anger from boiling out. Bryn held his gaze, calm, silent, as a general should be, as Gowan should be. Gowan looked away, suddenly feeling ashamed of himself. "Light," he whispered, releasing his sword and raising a hand to his head. He suddenly felt very, very tired. "I'm sorry, Gareth. You're right. I've been a fool." Bryn grunted. "Good to hear you say that. I was beginning to wonder what had happened to you." Gowan sighed, wiping his brow, wishing for something cool to drink. His anger melted away, and he felt exhausted. "It has been a difficult year," he said, "and I rode myself too hard getting here. I'm at the edge of my mind." "You aren't the only one, lad," Bryn said. He took a deep breath and walked to a small serving table, poured a cup of something for Gowan. It was only warm tea, but Gowan took it thankfully and sipped. "These are times to test men," Bryn said, pouring himself a cup. He took a sip and grimaced. "What?" Gowan asked, glancing down at his cup. "It's nothing. I despise this stuff." "Then why drink it?" Gowan asked. "It's supposed to improve my health," Bryn grumbled. Before Gowan could ask further, the large general continued, "So are you going to make me throw you in the stocks before you'll tell me why you decided to fight your way into my command post?" Gowan stepped forward. "Gareth, it's Egwene. They have her." "The White Tower Aes Sedai?" Gowan nodded urgently. "I know." Bryn took another drink, then grimaced again. "We have to go for her," Gowan said. "I came to ask you for help. I intend to mount a rescue." Bryn snorted softly. "A rescue? And how do you intend to get into the White Tower? Even the Aiel couldn't break into that city." "They didn't want to," Gowan said. "But I don't need to take the city. I just need to sneak a small force in, then get one person out. Every rock has its cracks. I'll find a way." Bryn set his cup aside. He looked at Gowan, firm, weathered face, an icon of nobility. But tell me this, lad. How are you going to get her to come out with you? Gowan started. Why, she'll be happy to come. Why wouldn't she? Because she's forbidden us to rescue her, Bryn said, clasping his hands behind his back again. Or so I've been able to gather. The Aes Sedai told me little. One would think they'd be more trusting toward a man they depend on to run this siege of theirs. Anyway, the Amelin can communicate with them somehow, and she's instructed them to leave her be. What? That was ridiculous. Obviously, the Aes Sedai in camp were fudging the facts. Bryn, she's imprisoned. The Aes Sedai I heard talking said that she was being beaten daily. They'll execute her. I don't know, Bryn said. She's been with them for weeks now, and they haven't killed her yet. They'll kill her, Gowan said urgently. You know they will. Perhaps you parade a fallen enemy before your soldiers for a time, but eventually you have to mount his head on a pike to let them know he's dead and gone. You know I'm right. Bryn regarded him, then nodded. Perhaps I do, but there's still nothing I can do. I'm bound by my oaths, Gowan. I can't do anything unless that girl instructs me to. You'd let her die? If that's what it takes to keep my oath, then yes. If Bryn was bound by oath, well, he'd sooner hear an Aes Sedai tell a lie than see Gareth Bryn break his word. But Egwene, there had to be something he could do. I'll try to get you an audience with some of the Aes Sedai I serve, Bryn said. Perhaps they can do something. If you persuade them that a rescue is needed and that the Amelin would want it, then we'll see. Gowan nodded. It was something, at least. Thank you. Bryn waved indifferently. Though I should see you in the stocks, for wounding 3 of my men, if nothing else. Have an Aes Sedai heal them, Gowan said. From what I've heard, you've no lack of sisters to bully you. Bah, Bryn said. I can rarely get them to heal anyone unless the soldier's life is threatened. I had a man take a bad spill while riding the other day, and I was told that healing would only teach him to be reckless. Pain is its own lesson, the blasted woman said. Perhaps next time he won't see fit to make sport for his friends while riding. Gowan grimaced. But surely they'll make an exception for those men. After all, an enemy did do the wounding. We'll see, Bryn said. The sisters rarely visit the soldiers. They've their own business to be about. There's one in the outer camp now, Gowan said absently, glancing over his shoulder. A younger girl, dark hair without the ageless face. No, this was an Aes Sedai. I could tell because of the face. She was kind of plump, with lighter hair. Probably just scouting for warders, Bryn said, sighing. They do that. I don't think so, Gowan said, glancing over his shoulder. She was hiding among the washwomen. As he thought about it, he realized that she could very well be a spy for the White Tower loyalists. Bryn's frown deepened. Perhaps he had the same thoughts. Show me, he said, striding toward the tent flaps. He threw them aside, walking back out into the morning light, Gowan following. You never did explain what you were doing here, Gowan, Bryn said as they walked through the orderly camp, soldiers saluting their general as he passed. I told you, Gowan said, and resting comfortably on the pommel of his sword. I am going to find a way to get Egwene out of that death trap. I didn't mean what you're doing in my camp. I meant why you were in the area in the first place. Why aren't you back in Caemlyn, helping your sister? You have news of Elaine, Gowan said, stopping. Right, he should have asked earlier. He really was tired. I heard that she was in your camp earlier. She's gone back to Caemlyn. Is she safe? She hasn't been with us for a long while, Bryn said, but she seems to be doing well. He stopped, glancing at Gowan. You mean you don't know? What? Well, rumors are unreliable, Bryn said. But I have confirmed many of them at the Aes Sedai who've been traveling to Caemlyn to listen for news. Your sister holds the Lion Throne. It seems that she's undone much of the mess your mother left for her. Gowan took a deep breath. Thank the light, he thought, closing his eyes. Elaine lived. Elaine held the throne. He opened his eyes, and the overcast sky seemed a little more bright. He continued walking, Bryn falling into step beside him. You really didn't know, Bryn said. Where have you been, lad? You're the first Prince of the Sword now. Or you will be once you return to Camelin. Your place is at your sister's side. Egwene first. You made an oath, Bryn said sternly. Before me. Have you forgotten? No, Gowan said. But if Elaine has the throne, then she's safe for now. I'll get Egwene and tow her back to Camelin where I can keep an eye on her. Or I can keep an eye on both of them. Bryn snorted. I think I'd like to watch you trying that first part, he noted. But regardless, why weren't you there when Elaine was trying to take the throne? What have you been doing that is more important than that? I grew entangled, Gowan said, eyes forward. Entangled? Bryn asked. You were at the White Tower when all this... He cut off, falling silent. The two walked side by side for a moment. Where did you hear sisters talking about Egwene's capture? Bryn asked. How would you know she's being punished? Gowan said nothing. Blood and bloody ashes, Bryn exclaimed. The general rarely cursed. I knew that the person leading those raids against me was too well informed, and here I was looking for a leak among my officers. It doesn't matter now. I'll judge that, Bryn said. You've been killing my men, leading raids against me. Leading raids against the rebels, Gowan said, turning hard eyes on Bryn. You may blame me for bullying my way into your camp, but do you honestly expect me to feel guilty for helping the White Tower against the force besieging it? Bryn fell silent. Then he nodded curtly. Very well. But that makes you an enemy commander. No longer, Gowan said. I've left that command. But I helped them, Gowan said. I no longer do. Nothing I see here will return to your enemies, Bryn. I swear it on the light. Bryn didn't respond immediately. They passed tents, likely for the high officers, approaching the palisade wall. Very well, Bryn said. I can trust you haven't changed enough to break your word. I wouldn't turn against that oath, Gowan said harshly. How could you think that I would? I've had experience with unexpected renunciations of oaths lately, Bryn said. I said I believe you, lad, and I do. But you still haven't explained why you didn't return to Camelin. Egwene was with the Aes Sedai, Gowan said. As far as I knew, Elaine was as well. This seemed to be a good place to be, although I wasn't certain I liked Elida's authority. And what is Egwene to you? Bryn asked softly. Gowan met his eyes. I don't know, he admitted. I wish I did. Strangely, Bryn chuckled. I see, and I understand. Come, let's find this Aes Sedai you think you saw. I did see her, Garth, Gowan said, nodding to the guards as they passed out the gates. The men saluted Bryn, but watched Gowan as they would a Blacklance, as well they should. We shall see what we find, Bryn said. Regardless, once I get you a meeting with the Aes Sedai leaders, I want your word that you'll go back to Camelin. Leave Egwene to us. You need to help Elaine. It's your place to be an Endor. I could say the same for you. Gowan surveyed the teeming followers' camp. Where had the woman been? You could, Bryn said gruffly, but it wouldn't be true. Your mother saw to that. Gowan glanced at him. She put me out to pasture, Gowan, banished me and threatened me with death. Impossible. Bryn looked grim. I felt the same way, but it is true nonetheless. The things she said, they stung, Gowan. That they did indeed. That was all Bryn said, but from him it spoke volumes. Gawain had never heard the man offer a word of discontent about his station or his orders. He had been loyal to Morghese, loyal with the kind of steadfastness a ruler could only hope for. Gawain had never known a man more sure or a man less likely to complain. It must have been part of some scheme, Gawain said. You know, Mother. If she hurt you, there was a reason. Bryn shook his head. No reason other than foolish love for that fop, Gabriel. She nearly let her clouded head ruin Andor. She'd never, Gawain snapped. Gareth, you of all people should know that. I should, Bryn said, lowering his voice. And I wish I did. She had another magic, Gawain said stubbornly. He felt the heat of anger rise within him again. Around them, peddlers glanced at the two, but said nothing. They probably knew not to approach Bryn. But now we'll never know it. Not now that she's dead. Curse Althor! The day can't come soon enough when I can run him through. Bryn looked at Gawain sharply. Althor saved Andor's son, or as near to it as a man could. How could you say that? Gawain said, pulling his hand away. How could you speak well of that monster? He killed my mother. I don't know if I believe those rumors or not, Bryn said, rubbing his chin. But if I do, lad, then perhaps he did Andor a favor. You don't know how bad it got there at the end. I can't believe I'm hearing this, Gawain said, lowering his hand to his sword. I won't hear her name soiled like that, Bryn. I mean it. Bryn looked him directly in the eyes. His gaze was so solid, like eyes carved of granite. I'll always speak truth, Gawain, no matter who challenges me on it. It's hard to hear. Well, it was harder to live. No good comes of spreading complaints. But her son needs to know. In the end, Gawain, your mother turned against Andor by embracing Gabriel. She needed to be removed. If Althor did that for us, then we have need to thank him. Gawain shook his head, rage and shock fighting one another. This was Gareth Bryn? These aren't the words of a spurned lover, Bryn said, face set as if shoving aside emotions. He spoke softly as he and Gawain walked, camp followers giving them a wide berth. I can accept that a woman could lose affection for a man and bestow it on another. Morghese the woman I can forgive, but Morghese the queen? She gave the kingdom to that snake. She sent her allies to be beaten and imprisoned. She wasn't right in her mind. Sometimes, when a soldier's arm festers, it needs to be cut free to save the man's life. I'm pleased at Elaine's success, and it is a wound to speak these words. But you have to bury that hatred of Althor. He wasn't the problem. Your mother was. Gawain kept his teeth clenched. Never, he thought. I will never forgive Althor. Not for this. I can see the intent behind that book, Bryn said. All the more reason to get you back to Andor. You'll see. If you don't trust me, ask your sister. See what she says of it. Gawain nodded sharply. Enough of that. I heard he noted the place where he'd seen the woman. He glanced toward the distant lines of washwomen, then turned and strode toward them, edging between two merchants with pungent pens full of chickens selling eggs. This way, he said, perhaps too sharply. He didn't look to see if Bryn followed. Soon the general got up to him, looking displeased, but he kept his peace. They walked down a crowded, twisting pathway among people in browns and dull grays, and soon reached a line of women kneeling before two long wooden troughs of slowly flowing water. Men stood at the far end, pouring water down the troughs, and the line of women washed clothing in the sudsy one, then rinsed them off in the cleaner trough. No wonder the ground was so wet. At least here it smelled of suds and cleanliness. The women had their sleeves rolled up to their upper arms, and most of them chatted idly as they worked, rubbing clothing against boards in the troughs. They were all dressed in those same brown skirts he had seen on the Aes Sedai. Gawain rested his hand idly on his pommel, inspecting the women from behind. Which one? Bryn asked. Just a moment, Gowan said. There were dozens of women. Had he really seen what he'd thought? Why would an Aes Sedai be in this camp, of all places? Surely Elaida wouldn't send an Aes Sedai out to spy. Their faces made them too easy to recognize. Of course, if they were that easy to recognize, why couldn't he spot her now? And then he saw her. She was one of the only women who wasn't chatting with those around her. She knelt with her head bowed, the yellow kerchief tied around her head, shading her face, a few locks of light hair sticking out from under the cloth. Her posture was so subservient that he almost missed her, but the shape of her body stood out. She was plump, and that kerchief was the only yellow one in the line. Gowan strode down the line of looking women, several of whom stood up, hands on hips, as they explained in no uncertain terms that soldiers with their big feet and awkward elbows should stay out of the way of women at work. Gowan ignored them, pressing on until he stood beside the yellow kerchief. This is insane, Gowan thought. There's never in all of history been an Aes Sedai who could force herself to adopt that kind of posture. Bryn stepped up beside him. Gowan stooped down, trying to get a look at the woman's face. She bowed down further, scrubbing more furiously at the shirt in the trough before her. Woman, Gowan said, may I see your face? She didn't respond. Gowan looked up at Bryn. Hesitantly, the general reached down and pushed back the plump woman's kerchief. The face underneath was distinctly Aes Sedai, with that unmistakable ageless quality. She didn't look up. She just kept working. I said it wouldn't work, said a hefty woman nearby. The woman rose and waddled down the line, wearing a tent-like dress of green and brown. My lady, I told her, you can do as you wish. I ain't the one to refuse such as you. But someone's going to notice you. You're in charge of the washwomen, Bryn said. The large woman nodded firmly, her red curls bouncing. Indeed I am, General. She turned to the Aes Sedai, curtsying. Lady Tagrin, I did warn you. Light burned me, but I did. I'm right sorry. The woman called Tagrin bowed her head. Were those tears on her cheeks? Was that even possible? What was going on? My lady, Bryn said, squatting down beside her. Are you Aes Sedai? If you are, and you command me to leave, I will do so without question. A good way to approach it. If she really was Aes Sedai, she couldn't lie. I'm not Aes Sedai, the woman whispered. Bryn looked up at Gowan, frowning. What did it mean if she said that? An Aes Sedai couldn't lie, so... The woman softly said, My name is Shemerin. I was Aes Sedai once, but no more. Not since. She looked down again. Please, just leave me to work in my shame. I will, Bryn said. Then he hesitated. But I'll need you to talk to some sisters from the camp first. They'd have my ears if I didn't bring you in to speak with them. The woman, Shemerin, sighed but stood up. Come on, Bryn said to Gowan. I have no doubt that they'll also want to talk to you. Best to get this over with quickly.
Chapter 25. In darkness. Shirian peeked into her dark tent, hesitant, but saw nothing. Allowing herself a smile of satisfaction, she stepped in and drew the flaps closed. Doing quite well for once. Of course, she still checked her tent before she entered, searching for the one who had sometimes lurked inside, the one whom she'd never been able to sense. It always felt as though she should. Yes, Shirian still checked, and probably would for months yet, but there was no need now. No phantom waited to punish her. The square little tent was large enough to stand up in, with a cot along one side and a trunk along the other. There was just room for a desk, but it would so crowd the space that she'd barely be able to move. Besides, there was a perfectly acceptable desk nearby, in Egwene's unused tent. There had been talk of giving that tent to someone else. Most sisters had to share, though more tents were being brought in each week. However, the Amerlin's tent was a symbol. As long as there was hope of Egwene's return, her tent should wait for her. It was kept neat by the inconsolable Chesa, whom Shiriam still caught crying about her mistress's captivity. Well, so long as Egwene was away, that tent was functionally Shiriam's for all but sleeping. After all, an Amerlin's keeper was expected to look after her affairs. Shiriam smiled again, sitting down on her cot. Not long ago, her life had been a perpetual cycle of frustration and pain. Now that was over. Bless Ramonda. Whatever else Shiriam thought of the fool woman, Ramonda had been the one to chase Halima and Shiriam's punishments out of the camp. Pain would come again. There was always agony and punishment involved in the service she gave, but she had learned to take the times of peace and cherish them. At times she wished she'd kept her mouth closed, not asked questions, but she had, and here she was. Her allegiances had brought her power, as promised, but nobody had warned her of the pain. Not infrequently she wished she'd chosen the brown and hidden herself away in a library somewhere, never to see others. But now she was where she was. There was no use wondering about what could have happened. She sighed, then removed her dress and changed her shift. She did so in the dark. Candles and oil were both rationed, and with the rebels' funds drying up, she'd need to hide away what she had for later use. She climbed onto the cot, pulling up the blanket. She wasn't so naive as to feel guilty about the things she'd done. Every sister in the White Tower tried to get ahead. That's what life was about. There wasn't an Aes Sedai who wouldn't stab her sisters in the back if she thought it would give her advantage. Shiriam's friends were just a little more practiced at it. But why had the end of days had to come now of all times? Others in her association spoke of the glory and great honor of being alive at this time, but Shiriam didn't agree. She'd joined to rise in White Tower politics, to have the power to punish those who spited her. She'd never wanted to participate in some final reckoning with the Dragon Reborn, and she'd certainly never desired to have anything to do with the Chosen. But nothing could be done now. Best to enjoy the peace of being free of both the beatings and Egwene's self-righteous pratings. Yes, indeed. There was a woman with great strength in the power standing outside her tent. Shiriam snapped her eyes open. She could sense other women who could channel, just like any other sister. Bloody ashes, she thought nervously, squeezing her eyes shut. Not again. The tent flaps rippled. Shiriam opened her eyes to find a jet-black figure standing above her cot. Slivers of moonlight passing through the fluttering tent flaps were just enough to outline the figure's form. It was clothed in an unnatural darkness, ribbons of black cloth fluttering behind it, the face obscured by a deep blackness. Shiriam gasped and threw herself from the cot, making obeisance on the canvas tent bottom. There was barely room enough for her to kneel. She cringed, expecting the pain to come upon her again. "Ah," a rasping voice said. "Very good. You are obedient. I am pleased." It wasn't Halima. Shiriam had never been able to sense Halima, who it appeared had been channeling saidin all along. Also, Halima had never come in such a dramatic way. Such strength. It seemed likely that this was one of the Chosen. Either that, or at least a very powerful servant of the Great Lord, far above Shiriam. That worried her to the bone, and she trembled as she bowed. "I live to serve, Great Mistress," Shiriam said quickly. "I, who am blessed to bow before you, to live during these times to—" "Stop your babbling," the voice growled. You are well placed in this camp, I understand. Yes, great mistress, Shiriam said. I am the keeper of the chronicles. The figure sniffed. Keeper to a ragged bunch of would-be Aes Sedai rebels. But that is no matter. I have need of you. I live to serve, great mistress, Shiriam repeated, growing more worried. What did this creature want of her? Egwene Alvear. She must be deposed. What? Shiriam asked, startled. A switch of air cracked against her back, and it burned. Fool. Did she want to get herself killed? My apologies, great mistress, she said quickly. Forgive my outburst. But it was by orders from one of the chosen that I helped raise her as Amelin in the first place. Yes, but she has proven to have been a poor choice. We needed a child, not a woman with merely the face of a child. She must be removed. You will make certain this group of foolish rebels stops supporting her, and end those blasted meetings in Tabayran-Riad. How is it so many of you get there? We have Tirangrial, Shiriam said hesitantly. Several in the shape of an amber plaque, several others in the shape of an iron disc, then a handful of rings. Ah, sleep weavers, the figure said. Yes, those could be useful. How many? Shiriam hesitated. Her first instinct was to lie or hedge. This seemed like information she could hold over the figure. But lying to one of the chosen? A poor choice. We had 20, Shiriam said truthfully. But one was with the woman Lyanna who was captured. That leaves us with 19. Just enough for Egwene's meetings in the world of dreams. One for each of the sitters, and one for Shiriam herself. Yes, the figure hissed, shrouded in darkness. Useful indeed. Steal the Sleepweavers, then give them to me. This rabble has no business treading where the chosen walk. I steal the Tirangrial? How is she going to manage that? I live to serve, great mistress. Yes, you do. Do these things for me, and you will find yourself greatly rewarded. Fail me. The figure contemplated for a moment. 3 days. Each of the Sleepweavers you fail to acquire in that time will cost you a finger. The chosen opened a gateway right in the middle of the room, then vanished through it. Shiriam caught a glimpse of the familiar tiled hallways of the White Tower on the other side. Steal the Sleepweavers? All 19 of them? In 3 days? Darkness above, Shiriam thought. I should have lied about the number we had. Why didn't I lie? She remained kneeling, breathing in and out for a long time, thinking about her predicament. Her period of peace was at an end, it appeared. It had been brief. She will be tried, of course, Siain said. The White sat on a chair provided for her by the 2 Reds guarding Egwene's cell. The cell door was open, and Egwene sat on a stool inside, also provided by the Reds. Those 2 guards, plump Cariandra and stern Patrinda, watched carefully from the hallway, both holding the source and maintaining Egwene's shield. They looked as if they expected her to dart away, scrambling for freedom. Egwene ignored them. Her 2 days of imprisonment had not been pleasant, but she would suffer them with dignity. Even if they locked her away in a tiny room with a door that wouldn't let in light, even if they refused to let her change from the bloodied novice dress, even if they beat her each day for how she had treated Elaida, Egwene would not bow. The Reds reluctantly allowed her visitors, as stipulated by Tower law. Egwene was surprised she had visitors, but Ciane wasn't the only one who had come to her. Several had been sitters. Curious. Nevertheless, Egwene was starved for news. How was the tower reacting to Egwene's imprisonment? Were the rifts between the Ajahs still deep and wide, or had her work started to bridge them? Elaida broke tower law quite explicitly, Ciane explained, and it was witnessed by 5 sitters of 5 different Ajahs. She has tried to forestall a trial, but unsuccessful. However, there were some who listened to her argument. Which was? Egwene asked. That you are a dark friend, Ciane said, and because of it she expelled you from the tower and then beat you. Egwene felt a chill. If Elaida was able to get enough support for that argument, it will not stand, Ciane said consolingly. This is not some backward village where the dragon's fang scrawled on someone's doors enough to convict. Egwene raised an eyebrow. She'd been raised in some backward village, and they'd had enough sense to look for more than rumors in convicting someone, no matter what the crime. But she said nothing. Proving that accusation is difficult by tower standards, Ciane said. And so I suspect that she will not try to prove it in trial, partially because doing so would require her to let you speak for yourself, and I suspect that she'll want to keep you hidden. Yes, Egwene said, eyeing the Reds lounging nearby. You are probably right. But if she can't prove I'm a dark friend and she couldn't stop this from going to trial, it is not an offense worthy of deposing her, Ciane said. The maximum punishment is formal censure from the hall and penance for a month. She would retain the shawl, but would lose a great deal of credibility, Egwene thought. It was encouraging. But how to make certain that Elaida didn't just hide her away? She had to keep the pressure on Elaida, like cursed difficult while locked away in her tiny cell each day. It had been only a short time so far, but already the lost opportunities grated on her. You will attend the trial? Egwene asked. Of course, Ciane said, even-tempered, as Egwene had come to expect from the White. Some Whites were all coolness and logic. Ciane was much warmer than that, but was still very reserved. I am a sitter, Egwene. I assume that you're still seeing the effects of the Dark One's stirring? Egwene shivered and glanced at her cell floor, remembering what had happened to Lyanna. Her own cell was far more austere than Lyanna's, perhaps because of the accusations of her being a dark friend. Yes, Ciane's voice grew softer. They seem to be getting worse. Servants dying, food spoiling, entire sections of the tower rearranging at random. The second kitchen moved to the 6th level last night, moving an entire section of the yellow Ajah quarters into the basement. It's like what happened with the Browns earlier, and that one still hasn't been worked out. Egwene nodded. With the way the rooms had shifted, those few novices whose rooms hadn't moved suddenly now had assigned accommodations on the 21st and 22nd levels, where Brown Ajah quarters had been. The Browns were, reluctantly, all moving down to the wing. Would it be a permanent change? Always before, the sisters had lived in the tower proper, the novices and accepted living in the wing. You have to bring these things up, Ciane, Egwene said softly. Keep reminding the sisters that the Dark One stirs and that the last battle approaches. Keep their attention on working together, not dividing. Behind Ciane, one of the Red Sisters checked the candle on the table. The time allotted for Egwene to receive visitors was ending. She'd soon be locked away again. She could smell the dusty, unchanged straw behind her. You must work hard, Ciane, Egwene said, rising as the Reds approached. Do what I cannot. Ask the others to do so as well. I will try, Ciane said. She stood and watched as the Reds took Egwene's stool, then gestured her back into the cell. The ceiling was too low for her to stand without stooping. Egwene moved reluctantly, bending down. The last battle comes, Ciain. Remember. The white nodded, and the door shut, locking Egwene into darkness. Egwene sat down. She felt so blind. What would happen at the trial? Even if Elida was punished, what would be done with Egwene? Elida would try to have her executed, and she still had grounds, as Egwene had, by the White Tower's definition, impersonated the Amyrlin seat. I must stay firm, Egwene told herself in the darkness. I warmed this pot myself, and now I must boil in it, if that is what will protect the tower. They knew she continued to resist. That was all she could give them. Chapter 26. A Crack in the Stone. Aviendha surveyed the manor grounds, swarming with people preparing to depart. Bashir's men and women were well trained for wetlanders, and they worked efficiently to stow their tents and prepare their gear. However, compared to the Aiel, the other wetlanders, those who weren't actual soldiers, were a mess. Camp women skittered this way and that, as if sure they would leave some task undone or some item unpacked. The messenger boys ran with their friends, trying to look busy so that they wouldn't have to do anything. The civilians' tents and equipments were only slowly being packed and stowed, and they would need horses, wagons, and teams of drivers to get them all where they needed to go. Aviendha shook her head. The Aiel brought only what they could carry, and their warband included only soldiers and wise ones. And when more than just spears were required for an extended campaign, all workers and craftspeople knew how to prepare themselves for departure with speed and efficiency. There was honor in that, honor which demanded that each person be able to care for themselves and their own, not slowing the clan down. She shook her head, turning back to her task. The only ones who truly lacked honor on a day like this were those who did not work. She dipped a finger into the pail of water on the ground in front of her, then raised her hand and let it hover over a second pail. A drop of water dripped free. She moved her hand and did it again. It was the type of punishment in which no wetlander could have seen significance. They would have thought it easy work, sitting on the ground, leaning with her back against the wooden logs of the manor house, moving her hand back and forth, emptying one pail and filling the other, one drop at a time. To them, it would have been barely a punishment at all. That was because wetlanders were often lazy. They would rather drip water into pails than carry rocks. Carrying rocks, however, involved activity, and activity was good for the mind and the body. Moving water was meaningless, useless. It didn't allow her to stretch her legs or work her muscles, and she did it while the rest of the camp gathered tents for the march. That made the punishment 10 times as shameful. She earned toll for every moment she did not help, and there was not a thing she could do about it. Except move water, drip by drip by drip. It made her angry. Then that anger made her ashamed. The wise ones never let their emotions dominate them in such a way. She had to remain patient and try to understand why she was being punished. Even trying to approach the problem made her want to scream. How many times could she go over the same conclusions in her mind? Perhaps she was too dense to sort it out. Perhaps she didn't deserve to be a wise one. She stuck her hand back in the bucket, then moved another drop of water. She didn't like what these punishments were doing to her. She was a warrior, even if she no longer carried the spear. She did not fear punishment, nor did she fear pain. But more and more she did fear that she would lose heart and become as useless as one who sand stared. She wanted to become a wise one, wanted it desperately. She was surprised to find that, for she'd never thought that she could desire anything with as much passion as she'd long ago wanted the spears. Yet, as she had studied the wise ones during these last months, and her respect for them had grown, she had accepted herself as their equal, to help shepherd the Aiel in this most dangerous of days. The last battle would be a test unlike any her people had ever known. Amis and the others were working to protect the Aiel, and Aviendha sat and moved drops of water. "Are you all right?" a voice asked. Aviendha started, looking up, reaching for her knife so abruptly that she nearly spilled the pails of water. A woman with short, dark hair stood in the shade of the building a short distance away. Min Farshaw's arms were folded, and she wore a coat the color of cobalt with silver embroidery. She wore a scarf at her neck. Aviendha settled back down, releasing her knife. Now she was letting wetlanders sneak up on her. "I am well," she said, struggling to keep from blushing. Her tone and actions should have indicated that she didn't wish to be shamed by conversation, but Min didn't seem to notice that. The woman turned and looked out over the camp. "Don't you have anything to be doing?" Aviendha could not suppress the blush this time. "I am doing what I should." Min nodded, and Aviendha forced herself to still her breathing. She could not afford to grow angry at this woman. Her first sister had asked her to be kind to Min. She decided not to take offense. Min didn't know what she was saying. "I thought that I could talk to you," Min said, still looking out at the camp. "I'm not sure who else I could approach. I don't trust the Aes Sedai, neither does he. I'm not sure he trusts anyone now. Maybe not even me." Aviendha glanced to the side and saw that Min was watching Rand al'Thor as he moved through the camp, wearing a coat of black, gold-red hair ablaze in the afternoon light. He seemed to tower over the Saldeans who attended him. Aviendha had heard about the events the night before when he had been attacked by Semirhage, one of the Shadow Souled themselves. Aviendha wished she had seen the creature before she was killed. She shuddered. Rand al'Thor had fought and won. Though he acted the fool much of the time, he was a skilled and lucky warrior. Who else alive could claim to have personally defeated as many of the Shadow Souled as he had? There was much honor in him. His fight had left him scarred in ways she did not yet understand. She could feel his pain. She'd felt it during Semirhage's attack, too, though at first she'd mistakenly thought it to be a nightmare. She'd quickly realized that she was wrong. No nightmare could be that terrible. She could still feel echoes of that incredible pain, those waves of agony, the frenzy inside of him. Aviendha had raised the alarm, but not quickly enough. She had toed to him for her mistake. She would deal with that once she was finished with her punishments. If she ever did finish. "Rand al'Thor will deal with his problems," she said, dripping more water. "How can you say that?" Min asked, glancing at her. "Can't you feel his pain?" "I feel each and every moment of it," Aviendha said through gritted teeth. "But he must face his own trials just as I face mine. Perhaps there will be a day when he and I can face ours together, but that time is not now. I must be his equal first," she added in her head. "I will not stand beside him as his inferior." Min studied her, and Aviendha felt a chill, wondering what visions the woman saw. Her predictions of the future were said always to come true. "You are not what I expected," Min finally said. "I have deceived you?" Aviendha said, frowning. "No, not that," Min said with a small laugh. "I mean, I was wrong about you, I guess. I wasn't certain what to think after that night in Caemlyn that night when we bonded Rand together. I feel close to you, yet distant from you at the same time." She shrugged. "I guess I expected you to come looking for me the moment you got into camp. We had things to discuss. When you didn't, I worried. I thought perhaps I had offended you." "You have no toe to me," Aviendha said. "Good," Min said. "I still worry sometimes that we'll come to a confrontation. And what good would a confrontation serve?" "I don't know," Min said with a shrug. "I figured it would be the Aiel way. Challenge me to a fight of honor. For him." Aviendha snorted. "Fight over a man?" Who would do such a thing? If you had tilt toward me, perhaps I could demand that we dance the spears, but only if you were a maiden, and only if I were still one too. I suppose that we could fight with knives, but it would hardly be a fair fight. What honor would there to be gained in fighting one with no skill? Min flushed, as if Aviendha had offered her an insult. What a curious reaction. I don't know about that, Min said, flipping a knife from her sleeve and spinning it across her knuckles. I'm hardly defenseless. She made the knife vanish up her other sleeve. Why was it that the Wetlanders always showed off such flourishes with their knives? Tom Marilyn had been prone to that as well. Didn't Min understand that Aviendha could have slit the woman's throat thrice over during the time it took to flash that knife like a street performer? Aviendha said nothing, however. Min was obviously proud of the skill, and there was no need to embarrass the woman. It is unimportant, Aviendha said, continuing her work. I would not fight with you unless you gave me grave insult. My first sister considers you a friend, and I would like to do so as well. All right, Min said, folding her arms and looking back at Rand. Well, I guess that's a good thing. I have to admit I don't much like the idea of sharing. Aviendha hesitated, then dipped her finger into the pail. Neither do I. At least she didn't like the idea of sharing with a woman she didn't know very well. Then what do we do? We continue as we have, Aviendha said. You have what you wish, and I am occupied by other matters. When it becomes a different time, I will inform you. That's straightforward of you, Min said, looking confused. You have other matters to occupy you? Like dipping your finger in buckets of water? Aviendha blushed again. Yes, she snapped. Just like that. You will excuse me. She stood and strode away, leaving the buckets. She knew that she should not have lost her temper, but she could not help it. Min repeatedly pointing out her punishment, her inability to decipher what the wise ones wished of her, Rand al'Thor constantly putting himself into danger, and Aviendha unable to lift a finger to help him. She could stand it no longer. She crossed the brown thatch of the manor green, clenching and unclenching her fists, keeping her distance from Rand. The way this day was going, he'd notice her wrinkled finger and ask why she had been soaking it. If he discovered that the wise ones had been punishing her, he would probably do something rash and make a fool of himself. Men were like that, Rand al'Thor most of all. She stalked across the springy ground, the brown thatch patterned with square impressions where tents had stood, threading her way through Wetlanders, scurrying this way and that. She passed a line of soldiers tossing sacks of grain to the next, and loading them in a wagon hitched to two thick-hoofed draft horses. She kept moving, trying to keep herself from exploding. The truth was, she felt just as likely to do something rash as Rand al'Thor would be. Why? Why couldn't she decipher what she was doing wrong? The other Aiel in the camp seemed as ignorant as she, though of course they had not spoken to her of the punishments. She remembered well seeing similar punishments when she'd been a maiden, and had always known to stay out of Wise One business. She rounded the wagon and found herself heading toward Rand al'Thor again. He was talking with three of Davram Bashir's quartermasters, taller than each of them by a head. One of them, a man with a long black mustache, pointed toward the horse lines and said something. Rand caught sight of Aviendha and raised his hand toward her, but she turned away quickly, moving toward the Aiel campsite at the north side of the green. She ground her teeth, trying unsuccessfully to tame her anger. Did she not have a right to anger, if only at herself? The world was close to ending, and she spent her days being punished. Ahead, she spotted a small cluster of wise ones, Amis, Bear, and Mylane, standing beside a pile of brown tent packs. The tight oblong bundles had straps for ease of carrying over the shoulder. Aviendha should have returned to her pails and redoubled her efforts, but she did not. Like a child with a stick charging a Narsh cat, She stalked up to the wise ones, fuming. Avienda, Bear asked, have you finished your punishment already? No, I have not, Avienda said, stopping in front of them, hands, fists at her sides. Wind tugged at her shirt, but she let it flap. Hurrying camp workers, both Aiel and Saldaean, gave the group a wide berth. Well, Bear asked. You are not learning quickly enough, Amis added, shaking her white-haired head. Not learning quickly enough? Avienda demanded. I have learned everything you have asked of me. I have memorized every lesson, repeated every fact, performed every duty. I have answered all your questions and seen you nod in approval at each answer. She stared them down before continuing. I can channel better than any Aiel woman alive, she said. I have left behind the spears and I welcome my place among you. I have done my duty and sought honor on each occasion. Yet you continue to give me punishments. I will have no more of it. Either tell me what it is you wish of me or send me away. She expected anger from them. She expected disappointment. She expected them to explain that a mere apprentice was not to question full wise ones. She expected at least to be given greater punishment for her temerity. Amis glanced at Melaine and Bear. It is not we who punish you, child, she said, seeming to choose her words with care. These punishments come by your own hand. Whatever I have done, Avienda said, I cannot see that it would have you make me Datsang. You shame yourselves by treating me so. Child, Amis said, meeting her eyes. Are you rejecting our punishments? Yes, she said, heart thumping. I am. You think your stakes as strong as ours, do you? Bear asked, shading her aged face with her hand. You presume to be our equal? Their equal, Avienda thought, panic setting in. I'm not their equal. I have years left to study. What am I doing? Could she back down now? Beg forgiveness, meet her toe somehow? She should hurry back to her punishment and move the waters. Yes, that is what she needed to do. She had to go, and I see no more reason to study, she found herself saying instead. If these punishments are all you have left to teach me, then I must assume that I have learned all that I must. I am ready to join you. She gritted her teeth, waiting for an explosion of furious incredulity. What was she thinking? She shouldn't have let Min's foolish talk rile her so. And then Bear started to laugh. It was a full-bellied sound, incongruous coming from the small woman. Melaine joined her, the sun-haired wise one, holding her stomach, slightly bulging from her pregnancy. She took even longer than you, Amis, Melaine exclaimed. As stubborn a girl as I've ever seen. Amis's expression was uncharacteristically soft. Welcome, sister, she said to Avienda. Avienda blinked. What? You are one of us now, girl, Bear said. Or soon will be. But I defied you. A wise one cannot allow others to step upon her, Amis said. If she comes into the shade of our sisterhood thinking like an apprentice, then she will never see herself as one of us. Bear glanced at Randall Thor, who stood in the distance, talking to Serene. I never realized how important our ways were until I studied these Aes Sedai. Those at the bottom simper and beg like hounds, and are ignored by those who consider themselves their betters. It is a wonder they achieve anything. But there is rank among wise ones, Avienda said. Is there not? Rank? Amis looked puzzled. Some of us have more honor than others, earned by wisdom, actions, and experience. Melaine held up a finger. But it is important, vital even, that each wise one be willing to defend her own well. If she believes that she is right, she cannot let herself be shoved aside even by other wise ones, no matter how aged or wise. No woman is ready to join us until she has declared herself ready, Amis continued. She must present herself as our equal. A punishment is not a true punishment unless you accept it, Avienda, Bear said, still smiling. We thought you ready weeks ago, but you stubbornly continued to obey. Almost I began to think you prideful girl, Mylene added with a fond smile. Girl no longer, Anise said. Oh, she's still a girl, Bear said, until one more thing is done. Avienda felt dazed. They'd said she wasn't learning quickly enough, learning to stand up for herself. Avienda had never allowed others to push her around, but these weren't others, they were wise ones, and she the apprentice. What would have happened if Min hadn't riled her? She would have to thank the woman, although Min didn't realize what she'd done. Until one more thing is done. What must I still do? Avienda asked. Ruidian, Bear said. Of course. A wise one visited that most sacred city twice in her life. Once when she became an apprentice, once when she became a full wise one. Things will be different now, Mylene said. Ruidian is no longer what it was. That is no reason to abandon the old ways, Bear replied. The city may be open, but nobody will be foolish enough to walk through the pillars. Avienda, you must... Bear, Amis cut in. If it is well with you, I would prefer to tell her. Bear hesitated, then nodded. Yes, of course. It is only right. We turn our backs on you now, Avienda. We will not see you again until you return to us as a sister returning from a long journey. A sister we had forgotten that we knew, Mylene said, smiling. The two turned from her. Then Anise began to walk toward the traveling ground. Avienda hurried to catch up. You may wear your clothing this time, Anise said, as it is the mark of your station. Normally I would suggest that you travel to the city by foot, even though we know of traveling now. But I think that custom is best bent in this case. Still, you should not travel directly to the city. I suggest traveling to Cold Rock's Hold and walk from there. You must spend time in the Threefold Land to contemplate your journey. Avienda nodded. I will need a water skin and supplies there. Ready and waiting for you at the hold, Anise said. We've been expecting you to leave this chasm soon. You should have left it days ago, considering all the hints we gave you. She eyed Avienda, who glanced down at the ground. You have no reason for shame, Anise said. That burden is upon us. Despite Bear's joking, you did well. Some women spend months and months being punished before deciding that they have had enough. We had to be hard on you, child. Harder than I've ever seen a ready apprentice treated. There is just so little time. I understand, Avienda said. And thank you. Anise snorted. You forced us to be very creative. Remember this time you spent and the shame you felt. For it is the shame any Datsang will know should you consign them to their fate. And they cannot escape it simply by demanding release. What do you do if an apprentice declares herself ready to be a wise one during her first few months of training? Strap her a few times and set her digging holes, I suspect, Anise said. I don't know of that ever happening. The closest was Savannah. Avienda had wondered why the wise ones had accepted the Shido woman without complaint. Her declaration had been enough, and so Anise and the others had been forced to accept her. Anise pulled her shawl.
1 second, I'll be right back.
There is a bundle for you with the maidens guarding the traveling ground. Once you reach Ruidian, travel to the center of the city. You will find the pillars of glass. Pass through the center of them and return here. Spend well your days running to the city. We pushed you hard so that you would have this time for contemplation. It is likely the last you will have for some time. Avienda nodded. The battle comes. Yes. Return quickly once you pass through the pillars. We will need to discuss how to best handle the Karakarn. He has changed since last night. I understand, Avienda said, taking a deep breath. Go, Anise said, and return. She put emphasis on the final word. Some women did not survive Ruidian. Avienda met Amice's eyes and nodded. Amice had been a second mother to her in many ways. She was rewarded by a rare smile. Then Amice turned her back to Avienda, just as the other two had. Avienda took another deep breath, glancing back across the trampled grass before the manor house to where Ram spoke with the quartermasters, his expression stern, the arm missing a hand held folded behind his back, the other arm gesturing animatedly. She smiled at him, though he wasn't looking in her direction. "I will be back for you," she thought. Then she trotted to the traveling ground, collected the pack, and wove a gateway that would deposit her a safe distance from Cold Rock's hold, beside a rock formation known as the Maiden's Spear, from which she could run to the hold and prepare herself. The gateway opened to the familiar dry air of the waste. She ducked through the gateway, exulting, finally, in what had just happened. Her honor had returned. "I came out through a small water gate, Aes Sedai," Shimmerin said, bowing her head before the others in the tent. "In truth, it wasn't so difficult once I left the tower and got into the city. I didn't dare leave by one of the bridges. I couldn't let the Amelin know what I was doing." Ramonda watched, arms folded. Her tent was lit by 2 brass lamps, flames dancing at the tips. 6 women listened to the runaway's story. Lelaine was there, for all that Ramonda had tried to keep her from hearing about the meeting. Ramonda had hoped that the slender blue would be too busy basking in her status in camp to bother with such a seemingly trivial event. Beside her was Swan. The former Amerlin had latched herself onto Lelaine with the strength of a barnacle. Ramonda was well enough pleased with the newfound ability to heal a stilling. She was yellow, after all, but a part of her wished it hadn't happened to Swan. Ramonda had not forgotten Swan's crafty nature, even if so many others in camp seemed to have done so. Lesser strength in the power did not mean decreased capacity for scheming. Shiriam was there, of course. The red-haired keeper sat beside Lelaine. Shiriam had been withdrawn lately and barely maintained the dignity of an Aes Sedai. Foolish woman. She needed to be removed from her place. Everyone could see that. If Egwene ever returned, and Ramonda prayed that she did, if only because it would upset Lelaine's plans, then there would be an opportunity. A new keeper. The other person in the tent was Magla. Ramonda and Lelaine had argued, with control, of course, over who would be the first to interrogate Shimmerin. They decided that the only fair way was to do it together. Because Shimmerin was yellow, Ramonda had been able to call the meeting in her own tent. It had been a shock when Lelaine had shown up with not just Swan, but Shiriam in tow. But they'd never said how many attendants they could bring. And so Ramonda was left with only Magla. The thick-shouldered woman sat beside Ramonda, listening quietly to the confession. Should Ramonda have sent for someone else? It would have looked very obvious, delaying the meeting for that. It wasn't really an interrogation, however. Shimmerin spoke freely, without resisting questions. She sat on a small stool before them. She refused a cushion for it. Ramonda had rarely seen a woman as determined to punish herself as this poor child. Not a child, Ramonda thought. A full Aes Sedai, whatever she says. Burn you, Elida, for turning one of us into this. Shimmerin had been yellow. Burn it, she was yellow. She'd been talking to them for the better part of an hour now, answering questions about the status of the White Tower. Swan had been the first to ask how the woman had come to escape. "Please forgive me for seeking work in the camp without coming to you, Aes Sedai," Shimmerin said, head bowed. "But I have fled the tower against them all. As an accepted leaving without permission, I am a runaway. I knew I would be punished if discovered. I have stayed in this area because it is so familiar, and I cannot let it go. When your army came, I saw a chance for work, and I took it. But please do not force me to go back. I will not be a danger. I will seek a life as a normal woman, careful not to use my abilities." "You are Aes Sedai," Ramonda said, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. This woman's attitude lent much credence to the things Egwene said about Elida's power-hungry reign in the tower. no matter what Elida says. Chimarin just shook her head. Light! She never had been the most poised of Aes Sedai, but it was shocking to see her fallen so far. Tell me about this Watergate, Swan said, leaning forward in her chair. Where could we find it? On the southwestern side of the city, Aes Sedai, Chimarin said. About 5 minutes' walk eastward from where the ancient statues of Elaine al-Landarin and her warders stand. She hesitated, suddenly seeming anxious. But it is a small gate. You couldn't take an army through it. I only know of it because I had the duty of caring for the beggars who live there. I want a map anyway, Swan said. Then she glanced at Lelaine. At least I think we should have one. It is a wise idea, Lelaine said in a nauseatingly magnanimous tone. I do want to know more of your situation, Margaret said. How is it Elida could think that demoting a sister was wise? Egwene did speak of this event, and I did find it incredible then too. What was Elida's thought? I cannot speak for the Amerlin's thought, Chimarin said. She cringed as the women in the room gave her a set of not-so-subtle glares at calling Elida the Amerlin. Ramonda didn't join in. Something small was creeping beneath the canvas floor of the tent, moving from one corner towards the center of the room. Light. Was that a mouse? No, it was too small. Perhaps a cricket. She shifted uncomfortably. But surely you did do something to earn her ire, Magla said. Something worthy of such treatment. Aye, Chimarin said. She kept glancing at Swan for some reason. Fool woman. Ramonda almost thought Elida had made the right move. Chimarin should never have been given the shawl. Of course, demoting her to accept it was no way to handle the situation either. The Amerlin couldn't be given that much power. Yes, that was definitely something under the canvas, determinedly pushing its way to the center of the tent. A tiny lump, moving in jerks and starts. I was weak before her, Chimarin finally said. We were speaking of events in the world. I could not stomach them. I did not show poise befitting an Aes Sedai. That's it? Lelaine asked. You didn't plot against her? You didn't contradict her? Chimarin shook her head. I was loyal. I find that hard to believe, Lelaine said. I believe her, Swan said dryly. Chimarin showed well enough she was in Elida's pocket on several occasions. This do be a dangerous precedent, Magla noted. Burn my soul, but it do. Yes, Ramonda agreed, watching the canvas-covered whatever it was inch along before her. I suspect she used poor Chimarin as an example, acclimating the White Tower to the concept of demotion. That will let her use it on those who are actually her enemies. The conversation hit a lull. The sitters who supported Egwene would likely head the list of those to be demoted, if Elida retained her power and the Aes Sedai reconciled. Is that a mouse? Swan asked, looking down. It's too small, Ramonda said. And it's not important. Small? Lelaine said, leaning down. Ramonda frowned, glancing at the spot again. It did seem to have grown larger. In fact, the bump jerked suddenly, pushing upward. The canvas floor split, and a thick-bodied cockroach, as wide as a fig, scrambled through. Ramonda pulled back in revulsion. The roach skittered across the canvas, antennae twitching. Swan took off her shoe to swat it. But the bottom of the tent bubbled up near the rip, and a second cockroach climbed through. Then a third. And then a wave of them, pouring through the split like too hot tea sprayed from a mouth. A black and brown carpet of scrambling, scratching, scurrying creatures, pushing over one another in their hurry to get out. The women screeched in revulsion, throwing back chairs and chairs as they stood. Warders were in the room a moment later, broad-shouldered Rorik bonded to Magla, and that coppery-skinned stone of a man was Barim Sheeran, bonded to Lelaine. They had swords drawn at the screams, but the cockroaches seemed to stump them. They stood, staring at the stream of filthy insects. Shiriam hopped up on her chair. Swan channeled and began to squash the creatures closest to her. Romanda hated to use the one power for death, even on such vile creatures, but she too found herself channeling air and smashing the insects in swaths. But the creatures were pouring in too quickly. Soon the ground was swarming with them, and the Aes Sedai were forced to scramble out of the tent and into the quiet darkness of the camp. Rorik pulled the flaps shut, though that wouldn't stop the insects from squeezing out. Outside, Romanda couldn't stop herself from running her fingers through her hair, just in case, to make certain none of the creatures had gotten into it. She shivered as she imagined the creatures scrambling over her body. "Is there anything in the tent that is dear to you?" Lelaine asked, looking back at the tent. Through the lamplight, she could see the shadowy insects scurrying up the walls. Romanda spared a thought for her journal, but knew that she'd never be able to touch those pages after her tent had been infested this way. "Nothing that I'd care to keep now," she said, weaving fire, "and nothing I can't replace." The others joined her, and the tent burst into flames, Rorik jumping back as they channeled. Romanda thought she heard the insects popping and sizzling inside. The Aes Sedai moved back from the sudden heat. In moments, the entire tent was an inferno. Women rushed out of nearby tents to look. "I do no think that was natural," Magla said softly. "Those did be four-spine roaches. Sailors do see them on ships that visit Shara." "Well, it isn't the worst we've seen from the Dark One," Swan said, folding her arms. "And we'll see worse yet. Mark my words." She eyed Shimmerin. "Come, I want that map from you." They left with Rorik and the others, who would alert the camp that the Dark One had touched it this night. Romanda stood watching the tent burn. Soon it was only smoldering coals. Light, she thought. Egwene is right. It is coming, fast. And the girl was imprisoned now. She'd met with the Hall the night before in the world of dreams, informing them of her disastrous dinner with Elaida and the aftermath of insulting the false Amelin. And yet Egwene still refused rescue. Torches were lit and warders roused as a precaution against more evil. She smelled smoke. That was the remains of all she had owned in the world. The tower needed to be whole, whatever it took. Would she be willing to bow before Elaida to make that happen? Would she put on an accepted dress again if it would bring unity for the last battle? She couldn't decide. And that disturbed her nearly as much as those scuttling roaches had.
Chapter 27. The Tipsy Gelding. Mat didn't escape the camp without the Aes Sedai, of course. Bloody women. He rode down the ancient stone roadway, no longer followed by the band. He was, however, accompanied by the 3 Aes Sedai, 2 warders, 5 soldiers, Talmanas, a pack animal, and Tom. At least Aludra, Amathera, and Eginin hadn't insisted on coming. This group was too big as it was. The 3 needle pines guarded the road, smelling of pine sap, and the air was melodic with mountain finches' calls. It was still several hours until sundown. He halted the band near noon. He rode slightly ahead of the clustered Aes Sedai and warders. After he'd refused Jolene horses and funds, they hadn't been about to let him win another point. Not when they could force him to take them down to the village, where they could spend at least one night in an inn with soft beds and warm baths. He didn't argue too loudly. He hated to have more tongues wagging about the band, and women did gossip. But there was little chance of the band passing without causing a stir in the village anyway. If any Seanchan patrols made it through these twisting mountain paths, well, Mat would just have to keep the band on a steady pace northward, and that was that. No use crying about it. Besides, he was beginning to feel right again. Down that road, spring breeze. He'd taken to wearing one of his older coats, red with brown trim, unbuttoned to show his old tan shirt beneath. This was what it was about. Traveling to new villages, throwing dice in the inns, picnic barmaids. He would not think of Tuon. Flaming Sean Chan. She'd be all right, wouldn't she? No. His hands almost free at the dicing. It had been far too long since he'd sat down in a corner somewhere and thrown with the ordinary sort. They'd be a little dirtier of face and coarser of language, but as good of heart as any man. Better than most lords. Talmanas rode just ahead. He'd probably visit a nicer tavern than that, a place to play cards, rather than throwing dice. But they might not have much of a choice. The village was of decent size, probably worthy of being called a town, but was unlikely to have more than 3 or 4 inns. Their choices would be limited. Decent size, Matt thought, grinning to himself as he took off his hat and scratched at the back of his head. Hinder's Tap would only have 3 or 4 inns, and that made it a small town. Why, Matt could remember when he thought Barrelon a large city, and it probably wasn't much larger than this Hinder's Tap. A horse pulled up beside him. Tom was looking at that blasted letter again. The lanky gleeman's face was thoughtful, his white hair stirring in the breeze as he spelled out the words. I've read them 1,000 times already. Why don't you put that away? Matt said. Tom looked up. It had taken some talking to get the gleeman to come down to the village, but Tom needed it. It was a distraction. I mean it, Tom, Matt said. I know you're eager to go after Moiraine, but it'll be weeks before we can break away, and reading over those words won't do anything but make you anxious. Tom nodded and folded the paper with reverent fingers. You're right, Matt. But I've been carrying this letter for months. Now that I've shared it, I feel, well, I just want to be on with it. I know, Matt said, looking up toward the horizon. Moiraine. The Tower of Genjai. I almost felt as if he could see the building out there looming. That's where his path pointed, and Caemlyn was just a stepping stone along the way. If Moiraine was still alive, Light, what would that mean? How would Rand react? The rescue was another reason he needed a good night dicing. Had he agreed to go with Tom? Those burning snakes. He had no desire to see them again. But he also couldn't let Tom go alone. There was an inevitability to it, as if a part of Matt had known all along that he had to go back and face those creatures again. They'd gotten the better of him twice now, and the eelfin had tied strings around his brain with those memories in his head. He had a big that was for certain. Matt had little love for Moiraine, but he wouldn't leave her to them, no matter that she was Aes Sedai. Bloody ashes. He'd probably be tempted to ride in and save one of the Forsaken themselves. And one was. Lanfear had fallen through that same portal. Burnham, what would he do if he found her there? Would he really rescue her as well? You're a fool, Matron Cawthon. Not a hero, just a fool. We'll get to Moiraine, Tom, Matt said. You have my word, burn me. We'll find her. But we have to see the band someplace safe. And we need information. Bail Doman says he knows where the tower is, but I won't be comfortable until we can go to some large city and sniff for rumors and stories about this tower. Someone has to know something. Besides, we'll need supplies. And I doubt we'll find what we need in these mountain villages. We need to reach Caemlyn if possible, though maybe we'll stop at Four Kings on the way. Tom nodded, though Matt could see he chafed at leaving Moiraine trapped, being tortured or who knows what. Tom's brilliant blue eyes got a far-off look to them. Why did he care so much? What was Moiraine to him but another Aes Sedai, one of those who had cost the life of Tom's nephew? Burn it, Matt said. We're not supposed to be thinking about things like this, Tom. We're going to have a good night of dice and laughter. There'll probably be some time for a song or two as well. Tom nodded, face growing light. He had his heart on the back of his horse. It would be good to see him open it again. You plan to try juggling for your supper again, apprentice? Tom asked, eyes twinkling. Better than trying to play that blasted flute, Matt grumbled. Never was very good at that. Rand took to it right fine, though, didn't he? Colors swirled in Matt's head, resolving to an image of Rand sitting alone in a room by himself. He sat square-legged in a richly embroidered shirt, a coat of black and red tossed aside and crumpled next to the log wall beside him. Rand had one hand to his forehead as if trying to squeeze away the pain of a headache. His other was... that arm ended in a stump. The first time Matt had seen that, a few weeks back, it had shocked him. How had Rand lost the hand? The man barely seemed alive, propped up like that, unmoving. Though his lips did seem to be moving, mumbling or muttering. Light, Matt thought. Bernie, what are you doing? Well, at least Matt wasn't near him. Count your fortunes in that, Matt told himself. Life hadn't been so easy lately, but he could have been stuck near Rand. Sure, Rand was a friend. But Matt didn't mean to be there when Rand went insane and killed everyone he knew. There was friendship and then there was stupidity. They'd fight together at the last battle, of course, no helping that. Matt just hoped to be on the other side of that battlefield from any Sayadine-wielding madmen. Oh, Rand, Tom said. That boy could have made a life for himself as a gleeman, I warrant. Maybe even a proper bard that he'd started when he was younger. Matt shook his head, dispelling the vision. Brand new, Rand, leave me alone. Those were better days, weren't they, Matt? Tom smiled. The three of us traveling down the river Aranel. Myrddraal chasing us for reasons unknown, Matt added grimly. Those days hadn't been so easy either. Dark friends trying to stab us in the back every time we turned around. Better than Golem and Forsaken trying to kill us. That's like saying you're grateful to have a noose around your neck instead of a sword in your gut. At least you can escape the noose, Matt. Tom knuckled his long white mustache. Once the sword is stuck into you, there's not much you can do about it. Matt hesitated, then found himself laughing. He rubbed at the scarf around his neck. I suppose you're right at that, Tom. I suppose you're right. Well, for today, why don't we forget about all of that? We'll go back and pretend things are like they once were. I don't know if that's possible, lad. Sure it is, Matt said stubbornly. Oh, Tom asked, amused. You're going to go back to thinking that old Tom Marilyn is the wisest, most well-traveled man you've ever known? You'll play the gawking peasant again, clinging to my coat every time we pass a village with more than one inn in it? Here now, that's all that. I hasten to differ, Matt, Tom said, chuckling. I don't remember much. Matt scratched at his head again. But I do recall that Rand and I did right well for ourselves after we split up with you. We made it to Caemlyn, at least. Brought your flaming harp back to you unharmed, didn't we? I noticed a few nicks in the frame. Burn you, none of that, Matt said, pointing at him. Rand practically slept with that harp. Wouldn't think of selling it, even when we were so hungry we'd have gnawed on our own boots if we hadn't needed them to get to the next town. Those days were fuzzy to Matt, full of holes, like an iron bucket left too long to rust. But he had pieced together some things. Tom chuckled. We can't go back, Matt. The wheel is turned for better or worse. And it will keep on turning as lights die and forests dim, storms call and skies break. Turn it will. The wheel is not hope and the wheel does not care. The wheel simply is. But so long as it turns, folk may hope, folk may care. For with light that fades, another will eventually grow, and each storm that rages must eventually die. As long as the wheel turns. As long as it turns. Matt guided Pips around a particularly deep cleft in the broken roadway. Ahead, Telmanis chatted with several of their guards. That is the sound of a song about it, Tom. Aye, Tom said, almost with a sigh. An old one, forgotten by most. I've discovered 3 versions of it, all with the same words, set to different tunes. I guess the area has me thinking of it. It's said that Doriel herself penned the original poem. The area? Matt said with surprise, glancing at the 3 needle pines. Tom nodded, thoughtful. This road is old, Matt. Ancient. Probably was here before the breaking. Landmarks like this have a tendency to find their way into songs and stories. I think this area is what was once called the Splintered Hills. If that's true, then we're in what was once Coromanda, right near the Eagle's Reaches. I bet you if we climbed a few of those taller hills, we'd find old fortifications. And what does that have to do with Doriel? Matt asked, uncomfortably. She'd been queen of Ardhall. She visited here, Tom said, penned several of her finest poems in the Eagle's Reaches. Burn me, Matt thought. I remember. He remembered standing on the walls of a high fort, cold on the mountaintop, looking down at a long, twisting roadway, broken and shattered, and an army of men with violet pennants charging up the hillside into a rain of arrows. The Splintered Hills. A woman on the balcony. The queen herself. He shivered, banishing the memory. Ardhall had been one of the ancient nations that had stood long ago when Manetheren had been a power. The capital of Ardhall had another name, Shadar Logoth. Matt hadn't felt the pull of the ruby dagger in a very long time. He was nearly beginning to forget what it had been like to be tied to it, if it was possible to forget such a thing. But sometimes he remembered that ruby, red like his own blood, and the old lust, the old desire, would seep into him again. Matt shook his head, forcing down those memories. Burnett, he was supposed to be enjoying himself. What a time we've had, Tom said idly. I feel old these days, Matt, like a faded rug, hung out to dry in the wind, hinting of the colors it once showed so vibrantly. Sometimes I wonder if I'm any use to you anymore. You hardly seem to need me. What? Of course I need you, Tom. The aging gleeman eyed him. The trouble with you, Matt, is that you're actually good at lying. Unlike those other 2 boys. I mean it. Burn me, but I do. I suppose you could run off and tell stories and travel like you used to, but things around here might run a lot less smoothly, and I sure would miss your wisdom. Burn me, but I would. A man needs friends he can trust, and I'd trust you with my life any day. Why, Matrim, Tom said, looking up, eyes glimmering with mirth. Bolstering a man's spirits when he's down? Convincing him to stay and do what is important rather than running off to seek adventure? That sounds downright responsible. What's gotten into you? Matt grimaced. Marriage, I guess. Burn me, but I'm not going to stop drinking or gambling. Ahead, Talmanis turned around and glanced at Matt, then rolled his eyes. Tom laughed, watching Talmanis. Well, lad, I didn't mean to get your spirits down. Just idle talk. I still have a few things I can show this world. If I really can free Moiraine, well, we'll see. Besides, somebody needs to be here to watch, then put this all to song someday. There will be more than one ballad that comes from all of this. He turned, rifling through his saddlebags. Ah, he said, pulling out his patchwork gleeman's cloak. He threw it on with a flourish. Well, Matt said, when you write about us, you might find a few gold marks in it if you saw your way to include a nice verse about Talmanis. You know, something about how he has one eye that stares in strange directions, and how he often carries this scent about him, which reminds one of a goat pen. I heard that, Talmanis called from ahead. I meant you to, Matt called back. Tom just laughed, plucking at his cloak, arranging it for best display. I can't promise anything, he chuckled some more. Though if you don't mind, Matt, I think I'll separate from the rest of you once we get into the village. A gleeman's ears may pick up information that won't be spoken in the presence of soldiers. Information would be nice, Matt said, rubbing his chin. The trail turned up ahead. Bannon said they'd find the village just beyond the turn. I feel as though I've been traveling through a tunnel for months now, with no sight or sound of the world outside. Burn me, but it would be nice to know where Rand is, if only to know where not to go. The colors spun, showing him Rand, but the man was standing in a room with no view of the outside, giving Matt no clue as to where he might be. Life's that tunnel most times, I'm afraid, Tom said. People expect a gleeman to bring information, so we pull it out and brush it off for display. But much of the news we tell is just another batch of stories, in many cases less true than the ballads from 1,000 years ago. Matt nodded. And, Tom added, I'll see if I can dig up hints for the incursion. The Tower of Genjai. Matt shrugged. We're more likely to find what we need in Fort Kings or Camelin. Yes, I know, but Alva made me promise to check. If you hadn't said no to keeping the boy distracted, I'd expect to open our saddlebags and find him in there. He really wanted to come. A night dancing and gambling is no place for a boy, Matt muttered. I just wish I could trust the men back at camp not to corrupt him worse than a tavern would. Well, he stayed back quietly enough once Noel got out the board. Alva was convinced that if he played snakes and foxes enough, he'd pick out some secret strategy for defeating the Aelfin and Eelfin. The lad still thinks he's coming with us into the tower, Tom said more quietly. He knows he can't be one of the three, but he plans to wait outside for us. Maybe burst in to save us if we don't come back soon enough. I don't want to be there when he discovers the truth. I don't intend to be there myself, Matt said. Ahead, the trees broke wide into a small valley with green pastures rising high along the hills to the sides. A town of several hundred buildings was nestled between the slopes, a mountain stream running down the middle. The houses were of deep gray stone, each with a prominent chimney, most of which curled with smoke. The roofs were sloped to deal with what were probably very snowy winters, though the only white still visible now was on distant peaks. Workers were already busy on several of the roofs, replacing winter-damaged shingles, and goats and sheep grazed the hillsides, watched over by shepherd boys. There were a few hours of light remaining, and other men worked on shop fronts and fences. Others strolled through the streets of the village, no urgency in their gait. Overall, the little town had a relaxing air of mixed industry and laziness. Matt pulled up beside Tilmanis and the soldiers. That's a nice sight, Tilmanis noted. I was beginning to think every town in the world was either falling apart, packed with refugees, or under the thumb of invaders. At least this one doesn't seem likely to vanish on us. I'd send it so, Matt said, shivering, thinking of the town in Altara that had vanished. Anyway, let's hope they don't mind dealing with a few strangers. He eyed the soldiers. All 5 were red arms, among the best he had. 3 of you 5 go with the Aes Sedai. I suspect they'll want to stay at a different inn from myself. We'll meet up in the morning. The soldiers saluted, and Jolene sniffed as she passed on her horse, pointedly not looking at Matt. She and the others headed down the incline in a little cluster, 3 of Matt's soldiers following. That looks like an inn there, Tom said, pointing toward a larger building on the eastern side of the village. You'll find me there. He waved, then kicked his mount into a trot and rode on ahead, Gleeman's cloak streaming. Arriving first would give him the best chance at a dramatic entrance. Matt glanced at Tilmanis, who shrugged. The 2 of them made their way down the slope with 2 soldiers as an escort. Because of the bend in the road, they were approaching from the southwest. To the northeast of the village, the ancient roadway continued. It looked strange to have such a large road leading past a village like this, even if that road was old and broken. Master Roydell claimed that it would lead them straight up into Andor. It was too uneven to be used as a major highway, and the direction it led no longer passed major cities, so it had been forgotten. Matt blessed their luck in finding it, though. The main passages into Murundi had been crowded with Shom-chan. According to Roydell's maps, Hinderstap specialized in producing goat's cheese and mutton for the various towns and manor lands in the region. The villagers should be used to outsiders. Indeed, several boys came running from the fields the moment they spotted Tom and his Gleeman's cloak. He'd make a stir, but a familiar one. The Aes Sedai, though, would be memorable. Ah, well, he thought as he and Telmanus rode down the grass-lined road. He would retain his good humor. This time he would not let the Aes Sedai ruin it. By the time Matt and Telmanus reached the village, Tom had already gathered a small crowd. He stood upright on his saddle and juggled 3 colored balls in his right hand while talking of his travels in the south. The villagers here wore vests and green cloaks of a deep velvety cloth. They looked warm, though upon closer inspection Matt noticed that many of them, cloaks, vests, and trousers, had been torn and carefully mended. Another group of people, mostly women, had gathered around the Aes Sedai. Good. Matt had half expected the villagers to be frightened. One of those standing at the side of Tom's group eyed Matt and Telmanus appraisingly. He was a sturdy fellow with thick arms and linen sleeves that were rolled to the elbows despite the chill spring air. His arms curled with dark hair that matched his beard and the locks on his head. "You have the look of a lord about you," the man said, approaching Matt. "He's a Telmanus began before Matt cut him off hastily. "I suppose I'd do at that," Matt said, keeping an eye on Telmanus. "I'm Barlden, the mayor here," the man said, folding his arms. "You're welcome to come and trade. Be aware that we don't have much to spare." "Surely you at least have some cheese," Telmanus said. "That's what you produce, isn't it?" "All that hasn't molded or spoiled is needed for our custom," Mayor Barlden said. "That's just the way of things these days." He hesitated. "But if you have cloths or clothing you'll trade, we might be able to scrape something up to feed you for the day." Feed us for a day, Matt thought. All 11 of us? He'd need to bring a wagon load back at least, not to mention the ale he'd promised his men. "You still need to hear about the curfew. Trade, warm yourselves by the hearths for a time, but know that all outsiders must be out of the town by nightfall." Matt glanced up at the cloud-covered sky. "But that's barely 3 hours away." "Those are our rules," Barlden said curtly. "It's ridiculous," Jolene said, turning away from the village women. She nudged her horse a little closer to Matt and Telmanus, her warders, as always, shadowing her. "Master Barlden, we cannot agree to this foolish prohibition. I understand your hesitation during these dangerous times, but surely you can see that your rules should not apply here." The man kept his arms folded and said nothing. Jolene pursed her lips, rearranging her hands on her reins so that her great serpent ring was prominently visible. "Does the symbol of the White Tower mean so little these days?" "We respect the White Tower." Barlden looked at Matt. He was wise. Meeting the gaze of an Aes Sedai tended to make one's resolve weaken. "But our rules are strict, milady. I'm sorry." Jolene sniffed. "I suspect that your innkeepers are less than satisfied with this requirement. How are they to make ends meet if they can't rent rooms to travelers?" "The inns are compensated," the mayor said gruffly. 3 hours. Do your business and be on your way. We mean to be friendly to all who pass our way, but we can't see our rules broken." With that, he turned and left. As he walked away, he was joined by a small group of burly men, several carrying axes, not threateningly, casually, as if they'd been out something wood, and just happened to be walking together, in the same direction as the mayor. "I should say this is quite a welcome," Telmanus muttered. Matt nodded. At that moment, the dice started rattling in his head. Burn it. He decided to ignore them. They were never any help anyway. Let's go find a tavern, he said, peeling Pips forward. Still determined to make a night of it, eh? Telmanus said, smiling as he joined Matt. We'll see, Matt said. Listen.
All right, everyone. You're caught into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.